The garage is quiet. Not the usual quiet. Not the low hum of machinery idling between adventures. Not the low murmur of Rick talking to himself while he tinkers. But a heavier kind of silence. The kind that only exists in the seconds before something breaks that was never supposed to break. Rick stands with his portal gun raised, the way he's stood 10,000 times before. His arm doesn't shake. His grip is steady. The trigger finger moves with the same lazy confidence it always has. Because why wouldn't it? This is the easiest motion in his entire life. Easier than breathing. Easier than lying. He pulls the trigger. Nothing. No green light. No spiral tearing open the air. No portal. Just a small mechanical click, swallowed instantly by the silence of the garage. Rick's eyebrows lower, just slightly. He pulls again. Click. Again. Click. His face doesn't panic. Not yet. But something flickers behind his eyes. Something that hasn't been there in a long time. Uncertainty. Morty watches from a few feet away, half paying attention, half expecting this to be one of Rick's typical delays before an adventure. But the delay stretches. Rick tries again and again. The gun that has ended empires, escaped death 100 times, and casually rewritten the rules of physics on a weekly basis is, in this moment, indistinguishable from a broken toy. For the first time in the history of this family, in the history of every universe Rick has ever touched, portal travel simply does not work. This is Solarix, Season 6, Episode 1, and this single moment deserves far more attention than it usually gets, because it isn't just a plot device. It's the first time the show forces its audience to sit with an uncomfortable question. What happens to a man who has spent his entire life escaping consequences when the tool that lets him escape suddenly stops working? For a few seconds, Rick is just a man in a garage. No multiverse, no godlike advantage. Just him, a broken device, and a grandson who's starting to notice something is wrong. This is where our story begins, not with the invention of portal travel, but with its collapse. Because to understand why losing it unsettled Rick, even for a moment, we first have to understand what it actually took from him to build it and what it's given him ever since. It's worth pausing here to notice what the show chooses not to do in this moment. A lesser series might have used a malfunctioning portal gun as a quick source of slapstick, a gag that resolves within a scene and never gets mentioned again. Solarix refuses that shortcut. The malfunction is treated with the gravity of a crisis, not the levity of a punchline. And that choice alone tells the audience this story intends to take its own premise seriously. If the central invention of the series can fail, then nothing about this world, including its smartest, most untouchable character, is quite as stable as 4 prior seasons trained viewers to assume. There's also something worth noting in how the show frames the visual grammar of failure. Every previous portal opening in the series follows the same rhythm. Trigger pulled, green spiral blooms outward, sound cue rises, motion begins almost instantly. The audience has been trained, episode after episode, to expect that rhythm without even consciously registering it anymore. Removing it, replacing the anticipated spiral with nothing at all, exploits that trained expectation directly. The silence isn't just narratively significant. It's technically disorienting in a way the show's most attentive viewers would feel in their bodies before they could articulate why. Portal travel is so casually woven into the fabric of Rick and Morty that it's easy to forget how strange it actually is. Most science fiction treats interdimensional travel as a plot event, a rare, dangerous, carefully guarded technology, something bound up in ceremony and risk. In this show, it's a Tuesday. Rick fires a portal to get milk. He fires one to escape an argument mid-sentence. He fires one because Morty is annoying him and he simply doesn't feel like finishing the conversation. The infinite is treated with the same enthusiasm most people reserve for a garage door opener. That casualness is the point. It tells us everything about who Rick is, and it tells us everything about what's at stake when it disappears. To understand the portal gun, you first have to understand what kind of person builds something that powerful and then uses it, primarily, to avoid emotional conversations. Because that's the pattern the show returns to again and again, quietly, almost as a running joke that eventually stops being funny. Rick doesn't use portal travel to explore. He doesn't use it, most of the time, out of scientific curiosity. He uses it the way other people change the subject. Rick Sanchez didn't invent portal technology to save the universe. He didn't build it for humanity, or curiosity, or even science in the purest sense. Every piece of evidence across the series points to something more personal. Portal travel was Rick's way of never being trapped again. Not in a marriage, not in a family, not in a single timeline of consequences, not in a version of himself he couldn't stand to look at. When the gun stops working in the garage, it isn't just an inconvenience. It's the temporary return of everything Rick built his life to avoid: permanence. To understand why this moment matters, we need to rewind, not to the beginning of the episode, but to the beginning of the idea. Because portal travel, as we know it in the show, didn't emerge from a single moment of inspiration. It emerged from decades of a man trying to outrun himself. Across the series, we see fragments of Rick's backstory, enough to piece together a shape, even if the full picture stays deliberately blurry. We know he had a family once, a version of stability that ended in tragedy. We know that whatever happened pushed him toward abandoning permanence altogether, and we know that at some point, in some universe, portal technology stopped being theoretical and became real. The show never gives us a single, tidy scene where Rick invents the portal gun for the first time. Instead, it gives us glimpses, flashbacks, references, throwaway lines that suggest invention wasn't a single event, but an obsession stretched across years, maybe decades, maybe centuries depending on which timeline you're watching. There's something almost cruel about how little the show explains directly. It wants the audience to feel the absence of an origin story, the way Rick himself seems to feel it. As a wound he's papered over so many times, he's stopped noticing the scar tissue. What we do know, concretely, from canon, is that portal technology exists across countless versions of Rick, all built independently, all converging on the same basic principle. That alone tells us something remarkable. This isn't an invention unique to one genius. It's an inevitability. Given enough intelligence, given enough desperation to escape, nearly every version of Rick Sanchez in the multiverse arrives at portal travel eventually. That detail matters more than it seems. It reframes the entire mythology of the show. Portal travel isn't Rick's genius. It's Rick's nature, expressed through technology. Every Rick, across every universe, is running from something. The portal gun is simply the shape that running takes when you're smart enough to bend reality around your own escape. There's a useful way to think about this pattern using the language of convergent evolution, the biological phenomenon where unrelated species, faced with similar environmental pressures, independently develop strikingly similar solutions. Wings evolve separately in birds, bats, and insects, not because of shared ancestry, but because flight solves a shared problem across very different starting points. Portal technology functions the same way across the multiverse of Ricks. Different lives, different tragedies, different starting circumstances, and yet nearly every version of the character arrives at the same essential invention. That convergence isn't coincidence. It's the clearest evidence the show ever gives us that Rick's core wound, whatever its specific shape in any given universe, produces the same underlying need for an exit, regardless of the details surrounding it. Think about what that implies for a moment. If nearly every version of Rick, regardless of the specific circumstances of his life, regardless of the planet or timeline or personal history, eventually arrives at the same invention, then portal travel isn't really a scientific achievement in the way the show's comedy sometimes plays it off as. It's closer to a psychological symptom, a shared coping mechanism that happens to double as the most powerful technology in the known multiverse. Every Rick, faced with enough pain, enough isolation, enough of his own company, eventually builds himself a door. Not because the door was inevitable, given enough intelligence, because the need for a door was inevitable, given enough of being Rick Sanchez. By the time we meet Rick C-137, the version of Rick the show follows, portal technology is no longer an invention in progress. It's a finished, casual, everyday tool. And this is important because it means the show deliberately skips the difficult, uncertain years of development. We don't see Rick fail. We don't see early prototypes malfunction. We meet him already at the top, already fluent in a technology most universes will never understand. This creates a particular kind of storytelling tension. The audience never sees the cost of building portal travel. We only see the cost of having it. There's a useful thought experiment worth entertaining here about what a prequel focused entirely on those missing years might reveal, if such a thing ever got made. We can guess at its shape from everything the show has scattered across later seasons. Isolation, obsessive iteration, probably failure piled on failure long before any success, and almost certainly the complete absence of anyone checking in on whether the man attempting this was doing all right. That absence of a support system during the invention years might be the single most important piece of context the show withholds from its audience. Genius, in most fiction, gets framed as something that happens in community. Mentors, rivals, collaborators. Whatever version of Rick built the earliest working portal technology appears to have done it entirely alone. And that isolation, more than the invention itself, may be the real origin of everything this documentary has traced so far. There's a final way to sit with that isolation before this section moves forward. Every subsequent chapter in this technology's history, the theft, the rivalry, the mechanics, the endless variations, the crisis, the hidden boundary, can be read as downstream consequences of a single foundational fact. Whoever built this first did so with no one watching. No one to catch a mistake before it hardened into habit. No one to ask why a person that gifted would spend his most productive years designing an exit rather than building anything meant to be shared. That absence of witness at the very beginning may explain more about the shape this entire mythology eventually took than any single plot point the show has given us since. There's a useful thought experiment worth entertaining here, one the show itself never stages directly, but which its structure invites. Imagine a version of this story told entirely from the perspective of the years before Rick C-137 became fluent with portal travel. The fumbling, the failure, the isolation of an inventor working alone on something no one around him could understand or verify. That story exists somewhere in the show's implied history, unfilmed, unspoken, present only as subtext beneath every effortless trigger pull we actually see on screen. Its absence isn't a gap in the writing, it's a choice, one that keeps the focus squarely on consequence rather than process, on what mastery costs rather than how it was earned. And the cost is enormous, even if Rick refuses to acknowledge it. Every time Rick escapes a dangerous situation through a portal, he's avoiding a lesson most people are forced to learn. That actions have consequences, that mistakes catch up with you, that running eventually stops working. Portal travel lets Rick sidestep that universal rule. Not escape consequences entirely. The show is very clear that consequences do eventually catch him, but delay them indefinitely, spreading them out across infinite universes so thin that they rarely land all at once. Picture the mathematics of that dilution for a moment. If a single mistake, made in a single universe, would ordinarily concentrate its full emotional and practical weight onto the person responsible, portal travel offers a strange kind of loophole. Rick can make the mistake in one universe and immediately relocate to another where that specific mistake never happened. The weight doesn't vanish exactly, but it stops being concentrated. It spreads thin enough across enough alternate versions of events that no single moment ever has to carry the full burden alone. That's not the same as innocence. It's closer to a kind of emotional accounting trick, one only available to someone with literal access to infinite alternate timelines, and one that ordinary people, without portal guns of their own, simply don't have the option to perform. This is why the garage scene in Solarix hits differently than a typical technology malfunction. It isn't just the gadget breaking. It's the sudden, jarring return of consequence into a life expertly built to avoid it. There's a useful thought worth pausing on here about the specific texture of that returning consequence. Consequence, in most stories, arrives loudly. An explosion, a confrontation, a visible reckoning the audience can watch unfold in real time. Here, it arrives as absence, as a small mechanical click where a spiral of green light should be. That's a much harder thing to dramatize, and it's part of why this scene deserves more credit than it usually gets for its restraint. The writers could have externalized this reckoning through a more conventional dramatic device. An enemy exploiting the outage, a race against time to fix it before disaster strikes. Instead, they let the silence itself carry the weight, trusting the audience to feel the significance of nothing happening, rather than needing something to happen in order to register the stakes. The scene lingers, longer than the show usually allows silence to linger. Morty's confusion slowly shifts into concern. He's used to Rick being annoyed, arrogant, dismissive, but not quiet, not focused like this. There's a particular kind of stillness that settles over Rick in these moments, one the show rarely gives him. Usually, his hands are always moving, always adjusting something, always reaching for the next tool or the next drink or the next distraction. Here, his hands go still, and that stillness is louder than any line of dialogue could be. "It's not working," Rick says eventually, flatly, almost to himself more than to Morty. 3 words, no sarcasm, no deflection. For a character built almost entirely out of deflection, that absence says more than any monologue could. There's a useful comparison to draw between this moment and how the show typically writes silence elsewhere. Rick's silences in nearly every other episode are strategic. He goes quiet when he's calculating, when he's about to reveal a plan, when he wants to make someone else uncomfortable enough to fill the gap he's created. This silence in the garage functions differently. It isn't strategic. It's involuntary, the kind of quiet that happens to a person rather than the kind a person deploys. That distinction, subtle as it is exactly the kind of detail an audience absorbs emotionally, without necessarily naming it. And it's part of why this particular scene lingers in a way so many of the show's louder, more chaotic moments don't. To understand the full weight of the portal reset in Solar Ricks, we need to look at how the show frames portal travel structurally, not just narratively, but mechanically, in a way viewers rarely think about. Across the series, portal travel functions less like a spaceship and more like an operating system. It has infrastructure, it has a network, it's regulated, loosely, by the Citadel of Ricks, an organization built entirely around managing the chaos that comes from countless versions of the same genius having access to reality-breaking technology. Portal travel isn't just Rick's invention. It's a shared, interconnected system that spans nearly every version of Rick and Morty across the multiverse. When portal travel fails in Solar Ricks, it doesn't fail for one Rick, it fails for the network. The Citadel itself experiences the same catastrophic outage. Every portal gun across every universe becomes equally useless. This detail transforms the scope of the event. This isn't a broken gadget story. It's the temporary collapse of an entire interdimensional infrastructure, the multiverse's connectivity going dark all at once. And the cause, according to canon, ties directly back to the actions Rick took at the end of the previous season. The portal reset isn't random misfortune, it's a consequence, a direct, traceable result of choices Rick made. Specifically, the chaos surrounding the Galactic Federation's collapse and the aftermath of Rick's surrender and eventual escape. Which brings us back to the deeper theme sitting underneath this entire episode. Portal travel breaking isn't bad luck. It's Rick finally being forced to live inside the consequences of his own actions, at a scale too large to escape through a single trigger pull. The visual of the Citadel without portal activity is one of the more quietly unsettling images in the show's history. This is a location built entirely around the assumption that travel between universes is instant, constant, and effortless. Seeing it frozen, Rick's and Morty's stranded, infrastructure dead, reinforces just how deeply portal technology isn't just a convenience in this universe. It's civilization's backbone. Imagine, for a moment, what daily life inside the Citadel actually looks like when that backbone disappears. Markets that depended on goods shipped between universes stall out mid-transaction. Bureaucrats who commuted between dimensional offices find themselves stuck exactly where they happen to be standing. An entire society built around the assumption of infinite mobility discovers, all at once, what it feels like to simply be somewhere, with no way of being anywhere else. The show doesn't dwell on these details explicitly, but they're implied in every static, portal-less shot of the Citadel skyline. For the audience, especially those experiencing this as background, ambient storytelling rather than an active thriller, this stillness creates something valuable: tension without noise. The scene doesn't need explosions or shouting to feel enormous. It only needs silence where sound should be. That's the storytelling instinct worth appreciating here. The writers understood that removing something ever-present is more dramatic than adding something new. We didn't need a bigger threat. We just needed the ordinary thing to stop. There's a useful comparison to draw from outside the show entirely, one that helps clarify why this particular kind of absence lands so effectively. Think about how a city feels during a widespread power outage, not because of a storm or a visible disaster, but simply because the grid failed. The buildings are the same, the streets are the same. Nothing has physically changed, except the invisible infrastructure everyone depended on without ever really noticing it. That's the emotional register Ricks is reaching for with its portrayal of the Citadel. Nothing about the physical space has changed. What's changed is the invisible layer of assumption everyone built their lives on top of, and its sudden absence is more unsettling than any visible catastrophe could be. This is worth remembering as we move through the rest of this documentary, because it establishes the emotional register the show keeps returning to whenever portal technology becomes a focal point rather than a background convenience. The stakes are rarely about a villain wielding the technology against our heroes in a conventional sense. The stakes are almost always about absence, about what a world built entirely around a certain kind of freedom looks like the moment that freedom is interrupted, however briefly. So, how does portal technology recover? How does an entire multiverse rebuild something so fundamental? The answer, in canon, is neither simple nor immediate. Portal travel doesn't return with a single fix. It returns gradually, through effort, through Rick actually having to work for something instead of pulling a trigger. This matters enormously to the emotional arc of the season, and we'll spend an entire section on the repair process later. The portal fluid crisis, the physical toll of manually restoring universal travel, the moments where Rick is forced to operate without the safety net he's relied on for years. But for now, in this opening section, what matters is the setup, the absence, the silence in the garage, the click of a trigger that changes nothing. Because before we can appreciate how portal travel gets rebuilt, we need to sit, just a little longer, in the discomfort of its disappearance. There's a quiet irony buried in this episode that's easy to miss on a first watch. Rick Sanchez, a man who has portaled away from funerals, arguments, failed relationships, and moral reckonings, is, for the first time in the show's run, completely unable to leave. Not because someone trapped him, not because an enemy outsmarted him, because the tool he built to never be trapped again simply stopped. This is the quiet brilliance of Ricks as a season opener. It doesn't need a new villain to create stakes. It only needs to take away the one thing Rick has always assumed would be there. And in doing so, it asks the audience, gently, without ever stating it outright, a question that will echo through the rest of the season, and honestly, through the rest of the show's mythology. If portal travel is what makes Rick who he is, what does Rick become without it? Consider how much of Rick's identity, as we've come to understand it over the show's run, is built on the assumption of an exit. Every relationship he has, with Morty, with Beth, with Summer, with the family he technically returned to but never fully rejoined, exists under the shadow of that exit. He stays because he chooses to, not because he has to. And the moment that choice is removed, even briefly, even by a broken trigger rather than a locked door, something in the foundation of who he is gets tested in a way nothing else in the show quite manages. There's a version of this question worth sitting with a little longer before moving on, because it doesn't just apply to Rick in the abstract. It applies to the specific shape of his relationships with everyone around him. Think about Morty, standing there in the garage, watching this unfold. For years, Morty's entire understanding of his grandfather has been built on an assumption of limitless capability, that whatever goes wrong, Rick will find a way out. That assumption isn't just comforting to Morty, it's structurally load-bearing for how he understands his own place in this family. A nervous, uncertain teenager tethered to a man who apparently can't be stopped by anything. Watching that man fail, even briefly, even over something as specific as a broken trigger, doesn't just threaten Rick's self-image, it threatens the entire framework Morty has built his sense of safety around. That's part of why this scene works as an opener for an entire season, rather than a contained bit of business resolved within a single act. The show isn't just testing Rick. It's quietly testing every relationship that depends on Rick being exactly as unstoppable as everyone assumes. Beth's trust in her father, Summer's admiration, Morty's reluctant loyalty. All of it rests on a foundation the garage scene cracks, however briefly, however invisibly to the characters themselves in the moment. The audience feels that crack, even if the characters don't fully register it yet. Consider, too, how differently this scene would read if it opened a season focused on an external villain rather than an internal malfunction. A season built around a new enemy establishes stakes through opposition. We understand the threat because we can see it, name it, anticipate its next move. A season that opens with a broken trigger establishes stakes through absence. And absence is a much harder thing for an audience to immediately parse. There's no face to the threat here. There's no monologue to deliver. There's only a silence where a sound should be, and the show trusts its audience enough to sit inside that silence without rushing to fill it with exposition. There's one more detail worth sitting with before we leave the garage behind. The show never has Rick voice his fear directly. He never says he's afraid, never admits that a broken trigger has rattled him. The closest we get is that flat three-word admission, and even that arrives stripped of the usual armor of sarcasm. This restraint is deliberate, and it's part of what separates this show's version of vulnerability from a more conventional one. Rick doesn't process fear the way most characters do, out loud, in monologue, with catharsis attached. He processes it by going quiet, by working the problem, by refusing to look directly at what just happened until he's already halfway toward fixing it. That's not the absence of feeling. It's a very specific, very Rick-shaped version of feeling everything and showing almost none of it. That question is the seed of everything that follows in this documentary, because to answer it, we have to go back. Back before the Citadel. Back before Rick C-137 casually fired portals to get milk. Back to the very first spark of the idea, the moment portal travel stopped being theoretical and became real. And as it turns out, the story of who truly built the first portal gun isn't the story most viewers assume. It doesn't start with Rick C-137 at all. It starts with the version of Rick this show would eventually reveal as its greatest villain. The one Rick who didn't just build portal travel for convenience. He built it to run from something far worse than boredom. There's a broader storytelling principle worth naming before we move forward. One that explains why this particular reveal works as well as it does dramatically. The most effective twists in long-running fiction rarely invent something from nothing. They recontextualize something the audience already accepted as settled. Portal travel had been settled, comfortable, background furniture for the majority of the show's run by the time this revelation arrives. The show didn't need a new gadget to shake that foundation. It only needed to ask a single, overdue question about the gadget audiences already knew intimately. Where did this actually come from? And whose hands built it first? That question, simple as it sounds, unravels years of assumed backstory in a single conversation, and it does so without requiring a single new invention to accomplish it. There's a further layer to this worth drawing out, one about how audiences relate to long-running fiction over time. By the point this reveal arrives, viewers have spent years assembling their own private theory of who Rick is, built almost entirely from inference, since the show has always been sparing with direct explanation. That private theory becomes, for many viewers, something close to personal property, a version of the character they feel they understand better than the writers are willing to state outright. Rick Mirai Jack doesn't just recontextualize the fictional history of a portal gun, it recontextualizes years of audience inference alongside it, asking longtime viewers to hold their own carefully assembled theory of Rick up against a piece of information that complicates nearly all of it at once. That's a rare kind of narrative risk, rewriting not just a character's history, but the audience's private relationship to that history. And it's part of why this particular episode continues to generate discussion well beyond its initial airing. It's also worth considering how this reveal reshapes our understanding of every earlier appearance of Rick Prime hinted at across the show's run. References that, on a first watch, read as vague and mysterious rather than load-bearing. Once the audience understands the true relationship between these two men, and between one man and the technology built by the other, those earlier hints stop functioning as simple foreshadowing. They become, retroactively, part of the emotional architecture the entire series has been quietly constructing since its earliest seasons, long before most viewers had any reason to suspect portal travel itself carried this much unresolved history. Before we cross that threshold, it's worth sitting a little longer with what the garage scene actually teaches us about how this documentary should be watched. Ricks isn't simply an episode about a broken gadget. It's a thesis statement, quietly embedded at the start of a season, about how the show intends to treat its own foundational mythology going forward. For 5 seasons, portal travel functioned as a narrative convenience, a way to get characters into new situations without spending screen time justifying the mechanics. Ricks changes that contract with the audience. From this point onward, portal travel isn't just a tool the story uses, it's a subject the story is actively interested in interrogating. That shift matters for how we approach everything that follows in this documentary. We're not simply cataloging gadgets, we're tracing the biography of an idea, one that began as a single man's escape and slowly, unavoidably, became the operating principle of an entire fictional universe. Every section from here forward builds on that same foundation, portal travel as psychology first, technology second. Keep that order in mind as we go back to the very beginning, to the lab that started it all. Section 2. The first portal gun. The room is cold, sterile, almost clinical. Unlike Rick C-137's cluttered garage, spare parts scattered like an artist's mess, half-finished inventions gathering dust in every corner, this space is precise, ordered. Every tool has a place. Every surface gleams. A figure stands with his back turned, watching a bank of monitors that flicker with data from 1,000 different timelines. He doesn't turn around right away. When he finally does, the resemblance is unmistakable. And yet, something about him feels wrong in a way that's hard to name at first. This is Rick Prime. He speaks with the same cadence, the same dry cleverness, the same barely contained condescension. But there's no burp. No stumble, no chaos, just control, total, practiced, absolute control. He offers something to the Rick standing across from him: portal travel, freedom, a way out. This is Rick Jack, Season 5, Episode 10, and it's arguably the single most important scene in the show's entire mythology. Not because of what happens, but because of what it reveals. That the portal gun, the device that defines Rick C-137's entire existence, was never something he invented alone in isolation. It came from somewhere else. It came from someone else. For 4 seasons, the show lets its audience assume something reasonable. That Rick C-137 is the Rick, the original. The genius who built portal travel first and let the technology ripple outward into the Citadel, into the multiverse, into the show's entire premise. It's a comfortable assumption because it fits the character we think we know, the smartest man in every room, the one who answers to no one. There's a reason this assumption goes unchallenged for as long as it does, and it isn't simply because the show withholds information. It's because everything the audience sees about Rick C-137 in earlier seasons reinforces exactly the story he'd want people to believe. He behaves like an originator, not an inheritor. He treats his portal gun with the possessive confidence of a man who built something himself, defends its modifications like personal accomplishments, dismisses questions about its origin with the same irritation he shows toward any topic he'd rather not discuss. The show doesn't need to lie to its audience directly, because its central character has already spent years lying, quietly and consistently, through the simple accumulation of small, confident gestures. Rick Jack dismantles that assumption entirely. Rick Prime isn't just another Rick. He's the Rick whose actions, a single act of devastating cruelty, set off the chain of grief, obsession, and vengeance that defines Rick C-137's entire character arc. And crucially, in the mythology the show finally lays bare, Rick Prime is revealed as the architect of portal technology as Rick C-137 understands it. Not the sole inventor across the infinite multiverse. We established earlier that portal travel is closer to an inevitability, arising independently across countless timelines, but the specific Rick whose version of the technology directly shaped the one C-137 would come to use and refine. This distinction matters enormously. It reframes the entire relationship between our protagonist and his portal gun. Every time Rick C-137 fires a portal, he isn't just using his own invention. He's using a technology whose lineage traces back to the man who destroyed his family. Think about how many times across the show's run Rick fires a portal without a second thought, mid-argument, mid-sentence, mid-thought. Now imagine each of those casual gestures carrying, underneath the comedy, the quiet fact of inheritance we've just uncovered. Every dismissive escape, every eye roll followed by a green spiral, is Rick reaching for a tool built first by the man he hates most in any universe. There's a bitter irony buried in that repetition, one the show never announces directly but leaves entirely for the audience to notice. The device that lets Rick avoid confronting his trauma is, itself, a physical remnant of that trauma's origin. He never truly gets away from Rick Prime. He just gets better and better at using Rick Prime's own tools to pretend otherwise. There's something worth sitting with here, something the show never states outright but leaves for the audience to notice on their own. The two versions of the portal gun look different not just because of wear and tear, but because of the personalities behind them. Rick Prime's version is efficient, minimal, almost elegant in its restraint. It does exactly what it needs to do, and nothing more. It reflects a man who has stopped feeling the need to prove anything to anyone. A man for whom portal travel isn't rebellion or escape, but simply infrastructure. A tool as unremarkable to him as a light switch. Rick C-137's version, by contrast, is patched, modified, clearly rebuilt more than once. It carries the fingerprints of a man who didn't inherit mastery. He fought for it, iteration after iteration, refining a stolen blueprint into something uniquely his own. That difference tells us something crucial about the emotional core of this rivalry. Rick Prime built portal travel and moved past it. Rick C-137 built his version because of Rick Prime and has never been able to move past that origin. Picture the two of them, side by side, if the show had ever allowed that comparison to play out visually for longer than a scene. Rick Prime, unbothered, precise, treating a device that spans infinite realities the way most people treat a set of car keys. Rick C-137, weathered, twitchy, carrying decades of obsession into every recalibration and repair. The technology is nearly identical. The men holding it could not be more different. And yet the show insists again and again that given enough time, enough loss, enough isolation, C-137 could easily become exactly what Prime already is. The scene in Rick Morty Jack plays out with a stillness that feels almost unbearable given what the audience knows is coming. Rick Prime offers portal travel, not out of generosity, but out of the same casual superiority he's carried the entire episode. To him, this is nothing, a gesture, a demonstration of how far ahead he's always been. For Rick C-137, watching this offer unfold means confronting something he spent decades avoiding. The technology that defines his entire existence, his entire relationship with his family, his entire identity as the smartest man in the universe. None of it is original. It's derivative, reactive, built in the shadow of someone he's hated for longer than he can clearly remember. This is the moment the documentary's opening question finally starts to make sense. We asked, if portal travel is what makes Rick who he is, what does he become without it? But Rick Morty Jack adds a darker layer to that question. What does it mean that the thing making Rick who he is was never fully his to begin with. To understand how devastating this reveal is, we need to look at what portal travel actually represents to Rick C-137 across the show's earlier seasons. In Close Rick Counters of the Rick Kind, Season 1, Episode 10, we get our first real glimpse into how seriously the Citadel, and by extension, the broader Rick community, treats portal technology. It isn't a toy. It's a controlled, regulated, almost sacred resource, jealously protected by an entire governmental structure built solely around managing versions of Rick and their access to interdimensional travel. That episode establishes something important. Even among a community of genius-level Ricks, portal mastery is treated as elite, something to be earned, refined, respected. Rick C-137's fluency with the technology, his ability to modify, calibrate, and personalize his portal gun beyond factory settings, is part of what makes him stand out even in a crowd of infinite versions of himself. But Rick Jack recontextualizes that mastery. Rick C-137 didn't become exceptional by inventing something new. He became exceptional by taking someone else's invention and making it lethal, precise, personal, sharpened by decades of obsession into something Rick Prime himself might not have anticipated. In a strange way, that reframes Rick C-137's genius as something rawer and more human than the show initially presents. He isn't the origin of portal travel, he's the survivor of it. Every improvement, every modification, every scar on that battered portal gun is evidence of a man refusing to let someone else's invention remain someone else's alone. There's a useful analogy here to inherited trauma more broadly. The way a person can spend a lifetime unconsciously carrying and reshaping something passed down to them, refining it, adapting it, making it functional for a life it was never originally built to serve. Rick C-137's relationship to portal technology mirrors that process almost exactly. What started as someone else's tool, built for someone else's purposes, becomes, through years of forced adaptation, something closer to a personal signature. The bitterness of the origin never fully disappears, but it gets buried under enough iteration that the object eventually reads as authentically his, even though the show has now made unmistakably clear that authenticity was never really the point of where it came from. The show is deliberately restrained about showing us the full origin of Rick C-137's hatred for Rick Prime. We get fragments, enough to understand the emotional shape of the wound, not enough to reduce it to a simple flashback montage. This restraint matters for our documentary's purposes because it tells us something about how the show wants portal travel understood. Not as a gadget with an origin story, but as a wound with a mechanism attached to it. Every portal Rick C-137 fires afterward carries that history, whether the show reminds us of it or not. The infinite convenience of portal travel, hopping between universes for groceries, adventures, escapes from responsibility, sits on top of an origin soaked in grief and vengeance. The lightness of how Rick uses the technology throughout most of the series becomes almost unbearable once you understand what it's actually built from. This is why Rick Jack functions as a pivot point for the entire mythology. Every casual portal joke in earlier seasons gets quietly recontextualized. The show was never asking us to laugh at meaningless technology. It was asking us to laugh at a man's constant, practiced avoidance of his own history, an avoidance made possible specifically because that history is the reason the technology exists. It's worth naming how rare it is for a comedy to survive this kind of retroactive weight without collapsing under it. Plenty of shows attempt a late series reveal that recontextualizes years of earlier jokes, and plenty of those attempts fail, either because the reveal feels unearned, or because the earlier material simply wasn't built with enough internal consistency to support new meaning being layered onto it after the fact. Rick and Morty manages the harder version of this trick. The comedy still works exactly as it did on a first watch. Nothing about the earlier jokes needs correcting or walking back. They simply gain a second, sadder layer, sitting quietly underneath the first, available to anyone willing to look for it, invisible to anyone who isn't. That's a difficult needle to thread, and the fact that the show threads it without sacrificing either its comedic tone or its emotional depth says something about how carefully this mythology was constructed, even in seasons that predate the reveal by years. There's a version of this story that could have played as simple revenge. Rick C-137 hunting the man who wronged him, powered by a stolen invention. But the show resists that simplicity in a way worth appreciating. Rick Prime isn't framed as a mustache-twirling villain hoarding technology out of spite. He's framed as something colder and more disturbing. A version of Rick who achieved total mastery over portal travel, and in doing so, lost any remaining attachment to consequence, relationship, or meaning. Rick Prime represents what Rick C-137 could become if his obsession with escape ever fully consumed what's left of his humanity. That's the real horror underneath the calm, clinical presentation of Rick Prime's lab. It isn't menace, it's emptiness. A portal gun used with such total fluency that using it no longer means anything at all. There's a broader pattern worth naming here, one that recurs across countless stories about technology and mastery. The more fluent someone becomes with a tool built for escape, the more that fluency risks becoming indistinguishable from a kind of death by convenience. Rick Prime doesn't fear consequence anymore, not because he's overcome it, but because he's automated his avoidance of it so completely that fear no longer has anywhere to attach itself. That's not strength in any meaningful sense. It's the furthest possible endpoint of the exact coping mechanism Rick C-137 is still, however reluctantly, in the middle of developing. Rick C-137, by contrast, despite everything, despite the sarcasm and the drinking and the decades of running, still flinches, still feels something when he uses the technology tied to his worst memory. That flinch, small as it is, might be the last meaningful difference between the two of them. It's worth pausing on how rare that kind of ambiguity is for a long-running animated series. Most shows would have made Rick Prime purely monstrous, a cartoon villain with no inner life beyond opposition to the hero. Instead, the show lets him be something closer to a mirror, a version of the same man who simply stopped resisting the coldest parts of himself. That choice elevates the entire portal gun mythology from a simple gadget of the week conceit into something closer to a character study conducted entirely through technology. So how did this single invention, built first by one Rick, stolen and reforged by another, end up reshaping not just two lives but an entire multiverse? The answer lies in what happens after invention. Portal travel doesn't stay contained to a single garage, a single lab, a single rivalry. It spreads. It gets copied, modified, regulated, weaponized, bureaucratized. What begins as one man's tool for either escape or domination becomes, within a matter of years across the show's internal timeline, the operating infrastructure for an entire civilization of alternate selves. To understand that spread, how a single stolen blueprint became the foundation for the Citadel, for interdimensional law enforcement, for casual grocery runs across universes, we need to look at how the technology actually works. Not just narratively, but mechanically. What's inside the gun? What powers it? What makes a portal, rather than simply a very dramatic light show? Because the deeper we look into the mechanics, the clearer it becomes that portal travel was never meant to be safe, controlled, or fully understood, not even by the men who built it. It's worth noting, too, how the show handles secondary characters who gain temporary access to portal technology, usually with disastrous or chaotic results. When someone other than a Rick attempts to use this technology, unfamiliar with its calibration, its quirks, its unspoken rules, the consequences tend to range from comedic to catastrophic. This recurring pattern reinforces something we've been building toward throughout this section. Portal travel isn't simply advanced. It's specialized to the point of near illegibility for anyone who hasn't spent years, possibly decades, developing an intuition for it. The technology behaves less like a tool anyone could theoretically pick up, and more like a second language, one only a narrow subset of the multiverse's population has ever become fluent in. There's a final thought worth carrying forward from this rivalry before we turn to the mechanics themselves. Every technology in fiction tends to inherit something of its creator's psychology, but rarely as literally as it does here. A weapon built by a paranoid inventor tends to be defensive. A weapon built by an arrogant one tends to be flashy. Portal technology, passed from Rick Prime to Rick C137, inherited something stranger. The specific psychology of a man who no longer believes staying anywhere is safe. That inheritance doesn't just explain how the device works. It explains why an entire multiverse of geniuses, presented with the option to build something more careful, more contained, more responsible, instead built countless versions of the same restless, boundary-breaking machine. Section 3. How portal guns work. The lab is quiet except for the hum of equipment. Rick's hands move with practiced precision over a disassembled portal gun, wires and small components spread across the workbench like an autopsy in progress. Morty leans in, curious despite himself. This is Close Rick Counters of the Rick Kind, Season 1, Episode 10. An episode ostensibly about clones and identity, but one that also gives us our clearest early glimpse into the actual mechanics behind the device that makes everything else in this show possible. Rick doesn't explain things because he wants to. He explains almost nothing willingly. But in moments of forced necessity, repairs, malfunctions, modifications, the show lets slip fragments of how portal travel actually functions. And piecing those fragments together across seasons gives us something close to a functional theory of the technology. At its simplest, canon establishes that portal travel requires three things: a stable power source, a calibrated targeting mechanism, and something the show refers to obliquely as portal fluid, a substance that appears to stabilize the connection between dimensions long enough for something to pass through safely. That third element deserves attention because it's the one piece of portal technology that isn't purely mechanical. It's chemical, organic even. And its scarcity, its difficulty to produce, becomes the central obstacle of an entire season's arc, something we'll return to later. For now, what matters is this. Portal travel isn't just electronics. It's electronics paired with something closer to alchemy. The visual language of the portal gun itself evolves subtly across the seasons, and it's worth noticing how deliberately the animators track that evolution. Early seasons show a relatively simple device: a barrel, a trigger, a dial. Later seasons show something more elaborate: additional components, visible modifications, signs of a tool that's been taken apart and rebuilt more times than its owner would ever admit to. This visual evolution mirrors something we touched on in the previous section: the idea that Rick C137's portal gun isn't a static invention, but an ongoing negotiation between a stolen blueprint and one man's relentless need to make it entirely his own. Calibration is where the show gets most of its comedic and dramatic mileage. A portal doesn't simply open to another universe in some vague sense. It opens to a specific coordinate within an infinite field of alternate realities. Get the calibration wrong, even slightly, and you don't end up somewhere adjacent to home. You end up somewhere unrecognizable. The show uses this constantly, sending Rick and Morty into universes where minor variables shifted into major consequences, dimensions where a single historical choice went differently, dimensions where the two of them never existed at all. This detail matters more than it first appears. It tells us portal travel was never designed as a precision instrument in the way, say, teleportation might be framed in other science fiction. It's closer to tuning an old radio, approximate, imperfect, dependent on a steady hand and an internalized sense of frequency that only someone who has done it thousands of times could develop. This framing also explains a recurring structural choice in the show's writing: why so many episodes hinge on Rick and Morty ending up somewhere they didn't intend to be. If portal travel were perfectly precise, the show would need to invent external reasons for every detour, sabotage, malfunction, outside interference. Instead, imprecision is baked into the premise itself. A single miscalibrated digit, a moment of distraction, an argument mid-trigger pull, any of these can send the pair somewhere unplanned. That built-in unpredictability isn't a writing crutch. It's a direct consequence of how the show has chosen to define its own technology. And it's part of why, nearly a decade into the series, the premise still generates fresh territory without needing to invent new gadgets every season. Which raises an uncomfortable question the show never answers directly. How many wrong universes did Rick pass through, silently, before he became good enough at this that we only ever see him land where he means to? How many versions of home did he glimpse and reject in the earliest days of this technology before he found one close enough to call his own? There's a haunting possibility worth sitting with here, one the show never confirms but never quite forecloses either. If early calibration really was as imprecise as the mechanics suggest, then some of Rick's first uses of this technology likely dropped him into versions of his own life close enough to recognize, but altered in some small, unbearable way. A family member missing, a choice gone differently, a life he almost had before the coordinates shifted him somewhere else entirely. We never see those early misfires on screen. We only see their aftermath, in the form of a man who eventually became so precise, so controlled in his targeting, that he apparently never has to confront an unwanted universe again. That precision, read this way, isn't just technical mastery. It's the scar tissue of however many accidental glimpses of a different life it took to develop it. There's a final thought worth extending from this idea before moving on to the technology's fuller catalog. If Rick really did spend some unknown stretch of early experimentation drifting into unwanted versions of his own history, that experience would explain something else the show never states outright: his apparent refusal, in nearly every later episode, to ever deliberately seek out a version of his lost family beyond the specific circumstances the plot forces on him. A man who accidentally brushed up against too many painful almosts during his earliest, clumsiest use of this technology would have every reason to build, over time, an almost superstitious precision around where he allows himself to land. Not because the destinations themselves are dangerous, because some of them, quite simply, hurt too much to risk stumbling into by accident ever again. The energy source powering the device is treated with similar vagueness. Deliberately, it seems, because specificity would undercut the show's storytelling priorities. We're never given a clean technical breakdown of exactly what powers a portal gun, the way a harder science fiction property might indulge in exposition. Instead, the show treats the power source the way it treats most of Rick's technology, as something so far beyond current human science that explaining it would be pointless. Rick doesn't bother, and the show doesn't either. What we do know, gathered from context across multiple episodes, is that portal energy draws from something ambient, something present across dimensional boundaries themselves, rather than stored conventionally like a battery. This would explain why portal guns can apparently be used indefinitely under normal circumstances without visible recharging, and why their failure in Solar Ricks reads as catastrophic rather than simply running out of batteries. If the power source were conventional, running out would be mundane. Instead, the show frames total failure as something closer to the multiverse itself losing a fundamental property, which tells us the energy isn't stored in the gun at all. It's channeled through it. This distinction, channeled rather than stored, reframes something important about the nature of the Citadel of Ricks. If portal energy is ambient, drawn from the fabric connecting universes rather than generated locally, then the Citadel isn't simply a city built by clever engineers. It's a civilization built directly on top of a natural resource unique to the structure of reality itself. That reframes the earlier collapse in Solar Ricks not as a technological failure in the ordinary sense, but as something closer to an entire civilization losing access to a shared resource overnight. It also explains why the repair process, which we'll cover in detail in the next section, requires more than fixing broken components. It requires re-establishing an entire relationship between a civilization and the underlying structure of reality that civilization depends on. Targeting mechanisms deserve their own attention, because this is where the show does its most interesting world building, without ever pausing to call attention to it. Across various episodes, we see hints that portal guns can be set to specific coordinates, that certain sequences of numbers correspond to certain dimensions, and that experienced users, meaning virtually any competent Rick, can navigate this system with something approaching intuition. This numeric targeting system becomes crucial world building once the show introduces its most consequential piece of dimensional lore, the Central Finite Curve, a boundary encompassing every universe accessible through standard portal technology. We'll examine that concept fully later, but it's worth flagging here because it directly ties into how targeting works. If portal guns can only reach coordinates within a bounded set of universes, that tells us portal travel was never truly infinite in the way the show's early, looser episodes implied. It was always constrained. Rick simply never told anyone, including possibly himself, where those constraints came from. There's something quietly poetic in how casually this technology gets treated on screen, despite how enormous its implications are. A device capable of accessing what is, for all practical purposes, every possible version of reality gets used, in the show's own internal logic, mostly to avoid difficult conversations, retrieve snacks, or escape mildly embarrassing social situations. That gap between the scale of the technology and the triviality of its use isn't a flaw in the writing. It's the entire thesis of the show's approach to science fiction. Portal travel isn't treated with reverence because Rick himself doesn't treat it with reverence. And that tells us again something about the man rather than the machine. A person in genuine awe of what they'd built would use it carefully, sparingly, meaningfully. Rick uses it like a house key. That's not because the technology is small. It's because Rick has made himself numb to things that would overwhelm anyone else. Consider what an outside observer, someone from a universe without any equivalent technology, might feel watching Rick use a portal gun for the first time. Awe, almost certainly. Fear, probably. A sense that they were witnessing something that should reorganize their entire understanding of what's possible. Rick offers none of that reverence to his own creation, and the gap between how the technology should read and how it actually gets used becomes, over enough episodes, its own kind of character study. The show trusts its audience to notice that gap without needing a character to point it out directly, which is part of why the portal gun functions so effectively as a storytelling device, even in episodes that aren't explicitly about its mythology. There's a related idea worth considering here, about what genuine mastery costs a person emotionally over time. In most fields, expertise deepens appreciation. A musician who has spent decades with an instrument tends to hear more in a simple melody than a beginner would, not less. Rick's relationship to portal travel runs in the opposite direction entirely. Decades of use haven't deepened his appreciation for what the technology represents. They've flattened it completely, until a device capable of reaching every conceivable version of reality registers, emotionally, as roughly equivalent to opening a refrigerator. That inversion, expertise producing numbness rather than wonder, might be one of the most quietly tragic details buried inside this entire mythology, and the show never once needs to state it directly for an attentive audience to feel its weight. There's a closing thought worth pairing with that inversion before this section ends. Perhaps the most honest thing this documentary can say about mastery, at least the specific kind of mastery portal travel represents in this story, is that it was never actually the goal. Rick didn't spend decades refining this technology because he wanted to become its foremost expert. He spent decades refining it because refinement was the only available substitute for the harder work he was avoiding, and expertise simply arrived as an accidental byproduct along the way. Genuine mastery, real mastery, tends to require presence, sustained attention paid to something for its own sake. What Rick achieved instead might be better described as fluency in absence, an extraordinary, hard-won ability to leave any given moment as quickly and as thoroughly as possible, dressed up through sheer repetition to look indistinguishable from expertise. There's a useful comparison here to how other characters within the show's universe treat similarly advanced technology when it first crosses their path. Side characters, one-off aliens, minor bureaucrats within the Citadel, nearly all of them react to portal travel with some baseline measure of appropriate astonishment, at least on first exposure. That reaction functions as a kind of narrative control group, a reminder of how an ordinary, reasonably intelligent being is supposed to respond to a device this powerful. Rick's total absence of that reaction isn't just characterization by contrast. It's the show quietly measuring, episode after episode, just how far Rick's emotional numbness has drifted from anything resembling a baseline response to genuine wonder. There's one more comparison worth drawing before closing this section out, between Rick's numbness and Morty's own evolving relationship to the same technology across the seasons. Morty begins the series reacting to portal travel the way any reasonable teenager would, with terror, nausea, protest. Over time, exposure dulls that reaction, not completely, but noticeably. By later seasons, Morty steps through portals with a weary familiarity that would have been unthinkable in his first appearances. That gradual shift matters enormously to this documentary's larger argument. It suggests numbness toward this technology isn't a trait unique to Rick's specific psychology. It's a predictable outcome of sustained exposure to something this powerful, a kind of tolerance that builds in anyone who spends enough time around it, regardless of whether they started out as the smartest man in the universe or merely his terrified, reluctant grandson along for the ride. There's a final, quieter implication worth sitting with as this section closes. If numbness toward portal travel really is a predictable outcome of exposure rather than a trait unique to Rick, then every character who spends enough time in his orbit is, in some sense, being slowly conditioned into the same emotional flattening that defines him. Morty's arc across the series can be read, in part, as a case study in exactly that conditioning, a boy who arrived terrified of the infinite and is gradually, episode by episode, being taught by proximity alone that the infinite isn't worth being afraid of anymore. That's not a comforting thought once you sit with it fully. It suggests portal travel doesn't just reflect Rick's particular relationship to consequence and escape. Give it enough time, enough exposure, enough casual use, and it teaches that same relationship to anyone standing close enough to watch him use it. There's a particular kind of loneliness embedded in that numbness, one the show rarely states directly but constantly implies. A man who can visit infinite versions of everyone he's ever loved, infinite versions of every life he could have lived, and chooses instead to use that power for errands, is a man who has, on some level, already decided none of those other lives would fix what's actually wrong. The infinite becomes ordinary not because it stops being remarkable, but because Rick has convinced himself nothing, no matter how vast, could actually reach him anymore. There's one more mechanical detail worth addressing before we move into cataloging specific guns. The question of why portal travel appears to respect certain narrative continuities at all. If the technology can access an effectively infinite range of alternate universes, why does the show so consistently return its characters to recognizable, familiar variations rather than truly alien, unrecognizable ones? Part of the answer is practical. A documentary about the show's own writing choices would note that familiar variations allow for the satire and character work the series is built around. But canon offers its own internal logic too. The targeting system, as established, isn't random. It responds to intention, however imprecise that intention might be in practice. Rick isn't dialing coordinates at random when he needs to reach a specific kind of universe, a version of Earth close enough to his own to be useful, a Citadel outpost, a particular ally's home dimension. He's aiming, however roughly, and the system responds to that aiming even when the results aren't perfectly precise. This distinction between random access and imprecise intention matters because it reinforces something central to the entire mythology. Portal travel was never designed as pure chaos. It was designed as controlled uncertainty, a system flexible enough to surprise its user, but responsive enough to still function as a tool rather than a gamble. That balance, uncertainty bounded by intention, mirrors something true about Rick himself. His life looks chaotic from the outside, but underneath the chaos, there's almost always a specific, if hidden, intention driving each decision. The technology, once again, turns out to be an extension of the man rather than simply a convenient plot mechanism layered on top of him. Understanding the mechanics gives us the vocabulary we need for what comes next. The specific portal guns that appear across the series, each with distinct design philosophies, distinct owners, and distinct consequences for the story. Because once you understand that a portal gun is not one static invention, but a constantly evolving negotiation between chemistry, ambient energy, and a targeting system bounded by rules its own creators barely acknowledge, you start to see just how many different versions of this technology exist, and how much each version reveals about the person who built it. There's also a worthwhile comparison to be made between portal technology and the show's other recurring gadgets, the memory-altering devices, the simulation technology, the various clone and duplication tools that populate the wider universe of Rick's inventions. Nearly all of them share a common thread. Each is, in its own way, a mechanism for avoidance. Memory tools let characters avoid pain. Simulation technology lets them avoid genuine risk. Cloning lets them avoid genuine sacrifice. Portal travel sits at the center of that constellation, not because it's more powerful than the others in a raw, technical sense, but because it's the most versatile. Where other inventions solve a single kind of discomfort, portal travel solves nearly all of them at once, simply by making it possible to leave. It's also worth pausing on how the show handles portal sickness, the brief disorientation characters occasionally display after especially rapid or repeated jumps. It's never treated as a major plot point, usually just a stumble, a groan, a beat of nausea before the scene moves on. But its presence matters for how we understand the technology's relationship to the human, or Rick-shaped, body using it. If portal travel produced no physiological cost whatsoever, it would read as pure, frictionless magic. The occasional stumble reminds the audience that even a technology this advanced still has to negotiate with biology. That crossing between universes isn't entirely free, even for the people who do it constantly. It's a small detail, easy to miss, but it reinforces something we'll see echoed later. Convenience, in this show, is never actually free. It just defers its cost somewhere the characters aren't looking. There's a broader world-building question worth raising here, too. Why does the show bother including this physiological cost at all, given how rarely it actually matters to any given plot? The answer, most likely, has less to do with strict internal consistency and more to do with tone. A show this committed to grounding its most absurd technology in small human textures, nausea, disorientation, a stumble after landing, earns the right to treat that same technology with the casual disregard its characters show it. The physiological cost doesn't need to matter dramatically to matter thematically. Its presence alone tells the audience that even the show's most powerful invention still has to answer, in some small way, to the limits of the body using it. And that detail quietly reinforces the larger argument this entire section has been building. Portal travel bends reality, but it has never fully escaped the constraints of being used by someone who is, underneath all the genius, still fundamentally a person. There's a final structural observation worth making about how this section fits into the broader arc of the documentary. Everything covered so far about mechanics, fluid, calibration, energy, targeting, sickness exists to answer a single implicit question the audience has likely been carrying since the very first section. How exactly does a broken trigger produce that specific, devastating silence in the garage? Now we know. The silence isn't mysterious once you understand the machinery behind it. It's the absence of chemistry, the absence of calibration, the absence of an entire hidden infrastructure the show finally chose to explain, piece by piece, once it had earned enough trust from its audience to slow down and actually show its work. That patience on the part of the writers mirrors something worth naming directly before this section closes. A less confident show would have rushed to explain its central technology far earlier, worried that audiences might lose interest without concrete mechanics to hold on to. Rick and Morty trusted its premise enough to let portal travel remain mysterious for years, confident that character and consequence would carry the audience just as effectively as exposition ever could. Only once the emotional stakes were fully established, only once the audience had years of investment in what this technology actually meant to the people using it, did the show finally slow down enough to explain how it works. That sequencing, meaning before mechanism, character before specification, is itself a quiet argument about what this entire documentary has been built around. That the most important thing about the portal gun was never really how it worked, but why anyone would ever need one in the first place. Section 4. Every major portal gun. Rick primes lab again, though something about this scene from Rick Mirai Jack feels different from the others. Less transactional, more revealing. Here, in a rare, unguarded moment, the show finally gives its audience language for something it had only ever gestured toward before: the Central Finite Curve. which we'll return to shortly. For now, this moment is the natural entry point into a wider survey, the many distinct portal guns that appear across the series, each a variation on the same core idea, each reflecting the philosophy of whoever built or wielded it. Rick Prime's design, as established, is minimalist and efficient, a tool built by someone who long ago stopped needing to prove anything through his technology. It does what it needs to do without embellishment, much like its owner speaks without embellishment. There is no wasted motion in either. Rick C-137's version, by contrast, carries visible history, modified, patched, rebuilt across years of independent tinkering. It's less a single object than an ongoing record of one man's refusal to let his most defining possession remain unchanged, unclaimed, or fully understood by anyone but himself. Standard Citadel-issue portal guns represent a third philosophy entirely: mass-produced, regulated, deliberately limited in capability compared to what an individual, genius-level Rick might build for himself. These are the guns issued to ordinary citizens of the Citadel, the vast population of Ricks and Mortys who never distinguished themselves the way our protagonist did. Functional, safe, unremarkable. The difference between a Citadel standard gun and Rick C-137's personal version is, in a sense, the difference between a factory model and one stripped down and rebuilt by an obsessive mechanic who no longer trusts anyone else's engineering. Both get you where you're going. Only one of them was built by someone convinced that following the standard blueprint was itself a kind of surrender. There's a class dimension to this worth noting too, one the show touches on through the broader structure of Citadel society. The Ricks and Mortys who carry standard-issue guns are, by and large, the ones the Citadel considers unremarkable, interchangeable, replaceable. Access to a modified, personalized device becomes a kind of status symbol within that world, a signal that the Rick carrying it distinguished himself enough to deserve something better than the default. Rick C-137's gun isn't just functionally superior, it's a badge of the exact kind of exceptionalism the Citadel's entire caste system is built around. Evil Morty's portal gun deserves particular attention because his arc across the series, culminating in the Season 5 finale, represents something the show had never shown us before. A Morty capable of not just using portal technology, but mastering and eventually surpassing the Ricks who were supposed to be his intellectual superiors. Evil Morty's technology, glimpsed throughout his appearances, reflects patience rather than raw power. Where Rick's various guns emphasize speed, aggression, improvisation, Evil Morty's tools, including, eventually, access to Citadel-level infrastructure, reflect years of quiet planning disguised as subordination. He didn't build a better portal gun by out-engineering Rick. He built a better strategy by understanding the entire system Rick's technology exists within and positioning himself to seize control of that system rather than just one device within it. This distinction matters enormously to the mythology. Portal guns, as objects, are only ever as significant as the ambition behind them. Evil Morty's genius wasn't a bigger gun. It was recognizing that the real power was never the trigger. It was the infrastructure the trigger connected to. There's a useful way to frame this contrast using the language of tools versus systems. A tool solves an immediate, local problem, getting from one place to another, escaping one uncomfortable moment. A system, once understood and controlled, solves problems at scale, shapes the behavior of countless individuals who never even realize they're operating inside someone else's design. Every Rick this documentary has examined so far, Prime, C-137, the Citadel's rank and file, thinks in terms of tools. Evil Morty is the first character in this entire history to think in terms of systems, and that single shift in perspective is what allows a character with none of the raw genius the Ricks pride themselves on to outmaneuver all of them simultaneously. There's a sobering coda worth adding to this contrast, one that reframes the entire Citadel hierarchy in a less flattering light. For an entire society built around the assumption that intelligence, specifically Rick-shaped intelligence, guarantees dominance, being outmaneuvered by a Morty represents a genuine crisis of self-understanding, not just a security failure. It suggests that raw processing power, however vast, isn't actually the deciding factor in who ends up controlling a system this complex. Patience is. Attention is. The willingness to spend years appearing weaker than you are while quietly mapping every lever worth pulling is. That's a lesson the Citadel's countless Ricks, for all their genius, seem constitutionally incapable of learning, precisely because their entire culture was built by men who never had to develop patience in the first place. There's a final irony worth naming here before we move on from this comparison. The Citadel, in its own internal mythology, almost certainly tells itself a story about intelligence being the ultimate determinant of status and safety, a story reinforced by every hierarchy the show shows us, every checkpoint, every bureaucratic structure staffed exclusively by versions of the same self-satisfied genius. Evil Morty's success doesn't just defeat that hierarchy from the outside, it quietly disproves the story the hierarchy tells about itself, using nothing more exotic than years of patience and a portal gun no more sophisticated than the ones everyone around him already carried. Sometimes the most devastating critique of a system isn't an attack from beyond its walls. It's proof, generated entirely from within, that the system's founding assumption about itself was wrong all along. It's worth situating this insight against everything the documentary has established so far about portal travel as an extension of personality. Every Rick we've examined treats the portal gun as an instrument of personal escape, a way to leave a room, a relationship, a consequence. Evil Morty represents the first major break from that pattern. He doesn't use the technology to escape anything. He uses it, ultimately, to arrive somewhere, to seize a position of authority he spent years quietly maneuvering toward. That inversion, escape technology repurposed as an instrument of ambition rather than avoidance, is part of what makes his arc land as such a genuine narrative surprise. He isn't running from anything. He's the only major character in this entire history who uses portal travel to finally stop running, even if what he arrives at isn't something the audience is meant to admire. Consider the patience that required. Every version of Rick across the Citadel operated under the assumption that a Morty, by definition, could never pose a real threat, could never outthink the very Ricks that technology was designed by and for. Evil Morty's entire strategy depended on that assumption remaining unchallenged for years, possibly longer, while he quietly positioned himself closer and closer to the actual levers of power. The portal gun, in his hands, was never the point. It was the last, almost incidental tool in a plan that had already succeeded long before he ever needed to fire one in anger. Yellow portal technology introduces another layer of complexity to this survey, one closely tied to the boundary we'll explore fully in the next section, the Central Finite Curve. Standard green portals, the kind Rick and virtually every Citadel citizen use daily, are canonically confined within this boundary. Yellow portals represent something rarer, a method of travel that pierces beyond that boundary into universes standard portal technology was never designed to reach. The scarcity of yellow portal technology tells us something important about the limits even a genius like Rick Prime accepted for most of his existence. If breaching the Central Finite Curve were simple, it wouldn't be treated as a significant plot device reserved for only the most consequential confrontations in the series. Its rarity is the point. It represents the edge of what this civilization's entire technological framework can achieve, the difference between mastering a system and escaping it entirely. Beyond named characters, the show gives us glimpses of other, stranger applications of portal technology. Federation-modified devices, prototype models referenced in passing, even implied historical versions used before the technology became standardized across the Citadel. These fragments rarely receive extended screen time, but they matter to a complete history, because they remind us that portal travel was never a single invention frozen in time. It was, and remains, an evolving arms race between countless versions of the same brilliant, broken man, each one convinced their version was the definitive one. Dinosaur-era portal technology, referenced in certain historical asides throughout the show's run, hints at something stranger still, that portal travel, or something functionally similar, may have existed on Earth long before Rick's generation, discovered and lost across cycles history barely remembers. Canon leaves this deliberately unresolved, a mystery the show gestures toward without ever fully answering, and one this documentary won't pretend to resolve on its behalf. But its presence tells us portal travel might be less a singular invention than a recurring discovery. One civilization after another stumbling onto the same doorway, only for it to be lost, buried, or forgotten before the next cycle finds it again. There's something almost mournful in that idea, if you sit with it long enough. If portal technology really has been discovered and lost across cycles of history, stretching back further than anyone in the current timeline realizes, then Rick Prime and Rick C137 aren't the first to hold this kind of power. They're simply the latest in a line of forgotten inventors, each one convinced their moment of discovery was unique, each one eventually swallowed by the same historical amnesia that erased whoever came before them. Power this vast, the show seems to suggest, doesn't guarantee permanence. It just guarantees a spectacular, temporary illusion of it. What ties every version of this technology together, Rick Prime's clinical efficiency, Rick C137's battle-worn improvisation, Citadel standard mass production, Evil Morty's patient systemic ambition, yellow portals breaching the boundary of everything known, is a single underlying truth. The portal gun was never really about the object. It was always about the person holding it, and what they were willing to become in order to keep holding it. There's a useful exercise in imagining how each of these portal guns would fare if their owners suddenly swapped devices. Rick Prime, handed C137's battered, over-modified weapon, would likely find it inefficient, cluttered with adjustments he'd never bothered to make himself, a physical record of struggle he's long since stopped needing to endure. Rick C137, handed Prime's minimalist design, might find it almost unnervingly simple, stripped of the personal touches that have come to define his relationship with his own technology. Evil Morty, given either, would likely set both aside in favor of studying the systems those guns connect to, uninterested in the object itself when the real leverage lies elsewhere. This small thought experiment underscores the documentary's central argument one more time. These tools were never interchangeable in any meaningful sense, because their value was never really located in their function. It was located entirely in the specific psychology of whoever built or claimed them. It's worth extending that same thought experiment one step further, to the ordinary Citadel citizen carrying a mass-produced standard-issue model. That person, handed either Rick Prime's minimalist design or Rick C137's obsessively modified version, would likely notice almost nothing different in daily function. Both would get them from one place to another with roughly the same reliability their factory model already offers. That's the point worth sitting with. The differences this documentary has spent so long tracing, the philosophy embedded in each design, the history encoded in each modification, are largely invisible to anyone who didn't build the device themselves. They matter enormously to the story, and almost nothing to the actual mechanics of getting from one universe to the next. Meaning, in this mythology, is almost always a private inheritance, legible only to the person who lived through however it was assembled. Which brings us back to where this documentary started. A garage, a silent trigger, a man forced to confront what happens when the object stops reflecting who he's become. Because if every version of this technology tells us something about its owner, then understanding what happens when it breaks tells us something even more revealing. Before we return to the garage, it's worth cataloging one more category of portal use the show occasionally gestures toward: improvised or emergency portal technology. Devices assembled quickly from spare parts under duress, rather than built with the careful precision of a personal weapon. These jury-rigged versions tend to be unstable, imprecise, more likely to misfire or land somewhere unintended. Their presence in the show's mythology reinforces something important about portal travel as a discipline, rather than a single, fixed invention. It isn't a formula anyone can follow. It's closer to a craft, one where quality depends enormously on the skill, patience, and resources of whoever is building the device in that particular moment. A rushed portal gun is a fundamentally different object from a decade-refined one, even if both technically accomplish the same basic function. Taken together, this full survey, Rick Prime's precision, Rick C.137's improvisation, Citadel mass production, Evil Morty's patient systemic ambition, yellow portals piercing the boundary of the known, and the rougher, improvised devices built under duress, tells a story less about escalating technology and more about escalating desperation. Each new variant doesn't simply do more than the last. It reveals a new way someone in this universe found to avoid sitting still. That, more than any single specification or blueprint, is the real evolution this documentary has been tracing all along. Section 5. The Portal Fluid Crisis. Back in the garage, Rick sets the disassembled gun down and exhales, slower than usual. Morty hovers nearby, unsure whether to ask questions or stay quiet. For once, Rick doesn't immediately reach for a solution. He just looks at the components spread across the workbench, as if trying to remember how to see them as separate from himself. This continuation of Solarix gives us our clearest look yet at what it actually takes to rebuild something this civilization has always treated as permanent. The core issue, once diagnosed, isn't a simple mechanical failure. It's depletion. The portal fluid that stabilizes dimensional travel has run dry. Not just for Rick, but across the entire interconnected network the Citadel depends on. This isn't a broken part that can be swapped out from a spare parts drawer. It's a resource crisis at civilizational scale. The show handles this crisis with an unusual amount of restraint. There's no dramatic countdown, no external villain forcing the stakes. Just the slow, uncomfortable realization that an entire society built its infrastructure on something it never bothered to make renewable. It's a quiet kind of commentary, delivered without ever stating it outright. Convenience built without redundancy eventually becomes vulnerability. For Rick personally, the crisis forces something rarer than danger: patience. Rebuilding portal fluid, according to what canon shows us, isn't something that can be brute forced through intelligence alone. It requires process, time, steps that can't be skipped no matter how smart the person attempting them happens to be. This is significant characterization because so much of Rick's identity is built around never needing to wait for anything. Every obstacle in his life has historically been solved through cleverness applied instantly. The portal fluid crisis denies him that shortcut. For the first time in a long time, being the smartest man in every room isn't enough. He has to actually do the work. There's a broader point worth making about how rarely this show lets its smartest characters simply be patient. Across nearly every prior season, urgency defines Rick's problem-solving. Quick fixes, improvised gadgets, solutions assembled in seconds because the plot demands them. The portal fluid crisis breaks that rhythm deliberately. It forces a different kind of storytelling, one built around duration rather than speed. And in doing so, it asks something rare of the audience, too: to sit with a problem that doesn't resolve the moment Rick decides to focus on it. That patience, uncomfortable as it is for a show built on rapid-fire chaos, ends up being the entire point. There's a quiet dignity in watching Rick move through this process without his usual bravado. He doesn't announce his genius at every step. He doesn't perform confidence for Morty's benefit. He just works, methodically, almost humbly, toward restoring something he's always taken for granted. Morty's presence throughout this arc matters too. Rather than being rescued from danger by Rick's competence, as in so many earlier episodes, Morty instead witnesses something closer to vulnerability. A grandfather figure whose greatest achievement has failed and who has no immediate way to fix it through sheer intellect alone. This shift recontextualizes their entire dynamic, if only briefly. For once, the power imbalance between them narrows. Rick isn't the untouchable genius solving impossible problems while Morty scrambles to keep up. He's a man doing slow, uncertain work, uncertain himself whether it will succeed. It's worth imagining how strange this must feel from Morty's perspective, watching the person he's relied on, resented, feared, and admired in roughly equal measure, suddenly reduced to ordinary effort. For years, Morty's entire relationship with Rick has been defined by an enormous gap in capability. Rick can fix anything, escape anything, outthink anything. Watching that gap narrow even briefly, even over something as specific as portal fluid, plants a seed that will echo through later, quieter moments between the two of them. The recognition that Rick's power was never infinite. It was just larger than anything Morty had personally encountered before. When portal travel finally returns, restored gradually rather than through a single triumphant fix, the show resists the temptation to treat it as a total return to normalcy. There's a lingering unease underneath the relief. The audience has now seen what this civilization looks like without its central technology. That knowledge doesn't disappear just because the crisis resolves. And neither, notably, does Rick's awareness of his own fragility. Even after portal travel returns, something has shifted. He's tasted what it feels like to be as stuck as everyone else. Whether or not he ever admits it aloud, that experience becomes part of the emotional undercurrent running through the rest of the season. This crisis also forces a reconsideration of everything established earlier about how portal technology actually works. If portal fluid can be depleted at civilizational scale, and if restoring it requires manual, gradual effort rather than instant technological fixes, then portal travel was never as limitless as its casual, daily use implied. It was always finite, always dependent on a resource this entire society quietly assumed would never run out. It's worth imagining, too, what the recovery process reveals about the Citadel's broader relationship to its own vulnerability. A civilization built entirely around convenience rarely spends much energy preparing for that convenience to disappear. There's no visible contingency plan referenced anywhere in canon. No emergency reserve, no backup infrastructure quietly waiting in case the primary system failed. That absence is its own kind of characterization, not of Rick specifically, but of an entire society that inherited his exact blind spot at civilizational scale. A culture built by countless versions of a man who never plans for failure will, unsurprisingly, never plan for failure either. There's a final observation worth making about this arc before moving on, one about pacing rather than theme. The show could have compressed this entire crisis into a single episode, a quick scare followed by a quick fix, the way so many procedural science fiction shows handle their technology failing. Instead, the recovery stretches, deliberately, across enough time that the audience genuinely feels the absence rather than simply being told about it. That pacing choice is itself a kind of thesis statement about what this documentary has been arguing from its very first section. The show doesn't treat portal travel as a plot mechanism to be repaired quickly so the real story can resume. It treats the repair itself as the real story, because what it reveals about Rick and about the civilization built in his image matters more than whatever adventure was waiting on the other side of a working portal gun. There's a closing note worth adding to this observation before the section ends. Pacing choices like this one rarely get credited the way plot twists or big reveals do, but they shape an audience's emotional experience just as powerfully, often more so, because they operate beneath conscious notice. A viewer watching this crisis unfold across its full, deliberate runtime absorbs the weight of waiting the same way Rick himself has to absorb it, gradually, uncomfortably, without a shortcut available. That shared discomfort between character and audience is, in its own quiet way, the most effective piece of characterization this arc offers, more effective than any line of dialogue could be. Because the audience isn't just told Rick had to wait, they have to wait too. There's a small final thought worth closing this section with. Waiting, of any kind, tends to strip away performance. A person can act clever, act tough, act unbothered for a single dramatic moment far more easily than they can sustain that performance across days, weeks, an unspecified stretch of gradual repair with no clear endpoint in sight. By forcing its audience to sit inside that duration alongside Rick, the show ensures we see him without the usual armor of a quick, witty escape. What's left, once the performance has nowhere left to hide, is simply a tired man doing the work, one unglamorous step at a time, because for once in his life, there was no shortcut left to reach for. That assumption, convenience mistaken for permanence, sits at the emotional center of this arc, and it echoes something larger about Rick himself. He has spent his existence assuming escape would always be available to him. The portal fluid crisis is the multiverse's version of that same assumption failing, all at once, for everyone who depended on it. There's a version of this crisis worth imagining from the perspective of an ordinary Citadel citizen rather than Rick himself. Someone with none of his genius, none of his personal history, simply a resident of a civilization that promised infinite mobility and then, overnight, failed to deliver it. For that person, the crisis isn't a philosophical lesson about consequence or permanence. It's simply catastrophic, a sudden and total collapse of the assumptions their entire life was built around. Jobs they can no longer commute to, family members suddenly unreachable, plans rendered meaningless by a failure they had no hand in causing and no ability to fix. The show never lingers on these ordinary casualties of Rick's world the way it lingers on Rick's own emotional journey, but their presence, implied rather than shown, adds a layer of quiet cost to this entire arc that's easy to overlook if you're only tracking the protagonist's internal experience. There's a final way of framing this asymmetry worth adding before moving on. Nearly every story about a powerful, flawed protagonist faces the same structural temptation. Center the emotional weight so completely on that protagonist that the ordinary people affected by their choices fade into background texture, present but unexamined. Rick and Morty doesn't fully escape that temptation here, and it probably shouldn't try to. This is fundamentally Rick's story, told through his eyes and his consequences. But the show leaves just enough space in the stranded crowds, the frozen infrastructure, the implied disruption to countless lives never given names or faces, for an attentive viewer to notice the gap between whose pain the story chooses to dramatize and whose pain simply happens, off-screen, as a side effect of someone else's crisis. There's a broader lesson embedded here about the nature of any system built entirely around convenience. Whether it's an interdimensional civilization or a single man's coping mechanism, systems designed without contingency eventually meet a moment they weren't built to survive. The portal fluid crisis isn't just a plot device. It's a structural metaphor for exactly the kind of unexamined dependency Rick has built his entire life around, just scaled up to the size of a multiverse so the audience can actually see it happen. There's a further layer worth adding to this metaphor, one that ties back to the earlier observation about ordinary Citadel citizens bearing the cost of a crisis they had no hand in causing. Rick's personal coping mechanisms rarely inflict damage at civilizational scale. They tend to hurt the people closest to him, Morty, Beth, occasionally himself, in ways that stay largely contained within his immediate orbit. The portal fluid crisis removes that containment entirely. For perhaps the first time in the show's mythology, the emotional pattern this documentary keeps tracing in one man's psychology gets externalized onto an entire society. And the show lets us watch what that pattern looks like once it's no longer just costing one family their peace of mind, but costing an entire civilization its basic functioning. There's a final way to think about scale worth adding here. Stories about a single flawed individual can only carry a limited kind of dramatic weight on their own, however well drawn that individual might be. Multiplying the consequences of that individual's psychology across an entire civilization doesn't just raise the stakes numerically, it changes the category of story being told, shifting the audience's attention from a single troubled man to the broader question of what happens when an entire culture organizes itself around one person's specific, untreated wound. That shift in scale is part of what elevates the portal fluid crisis beyond a simple bottle episode about resource scarcity. It becomes, instead, a portrait of what happens when personal avoidance calcifies into civic infrastructure. When one man's inability to sit still quietly becomes the operating principle an entire society builds its daily life around, without ever fully realizing what foundation it's actually standing on. There's a closing thought worth pairing with that idea before this section ends. Every civilization, fictional or otherwise, inherits its founding assumptions from whoever happened to be standing at the beginning, and rarely gets the chance to interrogate those assumptions until a crisis forces the question. The Citadel never chose, collectively, to build its entire existence around the premise that escape should always be instantaneous and effortless. That premise simply arrived, baked into the technology from the very first working prototype, inherited the way a language or a religion gets inherited, absorbed long before anyone thinks to ask where it actually came from. The portal fluid crisis is the closest this civilization ever comes to being forced to examine that inheritance directly. And even then, the show suggests, the lesson doesn't fully take. The infrastructure gets rebuilt, the convenience returns, and the underlying assumption, unexamined once again, quietly resumes its place at the center of everything. Once portal travel returns, the story moves outward again, beyond the boundaries this technology has always operated within. Because the more you study how portal travel actually functions, how fragile its infrastructure turns out to be, the more one particular limitation stands out. Portal guns, no matter how advanced, have never been able to reach everywhere. There's a boundary, a curve, a limit even Rick Prime, in all his clinical mastery, spent most of his existence accepting. There's a quieter parallel worth drawing before we move on. One between the portal fluid crisis and the earlier failure in the garage. Both moments strip away the same illusion, but at different scales. The garage scene shows us what happens to one man when his personal escape stops working. The fluid crisis shows us what happens to an entire civilization when its collective escape stops working. Neither crisis is solved through cleverness alone. Both require patience, labor, and an uncomfortable acceptance of limitation. The show seems to be building, deliberately, toward a larger argument. That no version of escape, whether personal or civilizational, is ever truly permanent, no matter how convincingly it's been dressed up as infrastructure. Understanding that boundary, and what it means for a small number of characters to eventually breach it, is where this story goes next. Section 6. Beyond Green Portals. Rick Prime's lab one more time, though something about this scene from Rick Mirai Jack feels different from the others, less transactional, more revealing. Here, in a rare, unguarded moment, the show finally gives its audience language for something it had only ever gestured toward before, the Central Finite Curve. The concept is simple to state and enormous in implication. Every universe Rick and Morty has ever visited, every alternate timeline, every parallel version of Earth, every variant of the Citadel, exists within a bounded set. Not infinite, not limitless, contained. For several seasons, the show let its audience believe portal travel granted access to literally infinite reality. That assumption made sense. Every episode reinforced the idea of endless variation, endless alternate versions of familiar characters. The reveal of the Central Finite Curve doesn't contradict that impression exactly, but it recontextualizes it. Yes, the universes within the curve are effectively infinite in their variety, but they're infinite within a container. A curve implies an edge, and an edge implies something existing beyond it. This detail matters because it reframes portal travel not as boundless freedom, but as freedom within a very large, very well-hidden boundary, one whose existence Rick Prime had apparently known about and deliberately kept obscured, for reasons the show only partially explains. The implication is unsettling once you sit with it. Every casual portal jump, every dimension-hopping adventure across the show's run, happened inside a boundary its own characters didn't know existed. The multiverse Rick and Morty explores so freely was never truly the multiverse. It was a curated section of it, vast enough to feel infinite, but finite all the same. Consider how this reframes even the show's earliest, silliest episodes in hindsight. Every alien planet, every parallel Earth, every bizarre dimension Rick and Morty stumbled into during the show's more comedic early seasons, all of it existed inside a boundary someone else had quietly drawn long before either of them was born. The comedy doesn't stop being funny in retrospect, but it does acquire a strange undertone once you know the playground had walls the characters simply hadn't found yet. Yellow portal technology, introduced as the method capable of piercing this boundary, becomes significant precisely because of how rare and consequential its use is within canon. If breaching the curve were routine, it wouldn't function as a dramatic device reserved for only the most pivotal confrontations. Its scarcity tells the audience something important. Even among characters as capable as Rick Prime, escaping this boundary represents the outer edge of what mastery over this technology can achieve. This raises a question worth sitting with, one the show leaves deliberately open. Who built the curve itself? Was it a natural property of reality? An emergent boundary formed by some deeper cosmic rule? Or was it constructed, deliberately, by some entity or event powerful enough to contain an infinite multiverse into something more manageable? Canon doesn't give a definitive answer, and this documentary won't pretend otherwise. But the question itself reshapes how we understand everything covered in the previous sections. Every portal gun, every version of Rick, every casual dimension hop treated as background comedy, all of it existed inside a structure whose true origin remains, even now, unresolved. It's tempting, faced with an unanswered mystery this large, to fill the gap with speculation. This documentary will resist that temptation, deliberately. The show itself seems to understand that some boundaries are more powerful left unexplained, that the not knowing is doing real thematic work rather than simply withholding information for its own sake. A universe this vast needs at least one mystery large enough that even its smartest character can't solve it. The Central Finite Curve is that mystery, and its unresolved nature may be the most honest thing the show has ever said about the limits of even Rick Sanchez's understanding. There's a useful contrast worth drawing between this restraint and how a lesser series might have handled the same idea. A show more interested in spectacle than character would almost certainly have turned the origin of the curve into a season-long mystery box, a puzzle to be solved, complete with a satisfying reveal and a new villain waiting behind it. Rick and Morty declines that path, and the decision says something important about its priorities. The curve isn't there to generate a new plot. It's there to generate a new feeling, the specific vertigo of realizing a lifetime of assumed freedom was quietly bounded the whole time. That feeling doesn't need an explanation to land. In some ways, it lands harder without one. There's a thematic symmetry worth noting here, one that ties this section back to where our documentary began. Earlier, we watched portal travel fail entirely, a temporary, civilization-wide collapse of something everyone assumed was permanent. Here, in the reveal of the Central Finite Curve, we learn that even when portal travel works exactly as intended, it was never as limitless as it appeared. Both moments puncture the same illusion from different directions, the assumption that this technology represented true, unrestricted freedom. It didn't. It never did. Rick built an escape from responsibility, from consequence, from permanence. But even that escape had walls he didn't build, and, for most of his existence, didn't even know were there. There's something almost tragic in imagining how long Rick operated under the belief that his freedom was absolute. Decades, possibly longer, of treating portal travel as the ultimate expression of his own limitlessness, all while unknowingly operating inside a structure whose boundaries were set by forces entirely outside his control or understanding. It recontextualizes every moment of arrogance the show has ever given him. The smartest man in the universe spent most of his existence certain he had no ceiling, when in fact, he simply hadn't found it yet. This recontextualization forces a final, uncomfortable question about Rick himself. If the smartest man across an entire bounded multiverse spent decades believing his freedom was total, when it was in fact contained all along, what does that say about the nature of freedom itself within this story? Is total escape ever really possible? Or is every version of freedom, even the multiversal kind, ultimately just a larger space with walls further away than anyone bothered to check? The show never answers this directly, but it lingers underneath everything that follows, including the quieter, more contemplative episodes of the seasons still to come. Episodes less concerned with cosmic boundaries and more concerned with what a man does once he's forced to acknowledge them. There's a philosophical tradition worth briefly gesturing toward here, without overstating the show's own ambitions. The idea that total freedom might be, on some level, indistinguishable from a larger kind of constraint isn't new to fiction or to philosophy more broadly. What makes this particular version compelling is how literally the show renders it, not as metaphor alone, but as an actual, mapped, describable boundary within its own internal physics. Most stories that explore this idea keep it abstract. A feeling, a mood, a theme implied rather than drawn. Rick and Morty draws it. It gives the audience a curve, a shape, something nearly geometric to hold on to, and in doing so, it makes an old philosophical question feel newly concrete, newly worth sitting with, even for viewers who've encountered versions of this idea in other contexts before. There's a final way of thinking about the curve worth offering before this section closes, one that reframes it less as a limitation on Rick's power and more as an accidental kindness. A truly infinite multiverse, without any boundary at all, would be functionally meaningless, a scale so vast that no single choice, no single relationship, no single life could ever carry weight against the sheer number of alternatives available. The curve, whatever built it and for whatever reason, inadvertently gives this story stakes. It ensures that the versions of Beth, Morty, Summer, and even Rick himself that we've come to know across the series actually matter within some finite, comprehensible space, rather than dissolving into statistical insignificance against a truly boundless backdrop. Rick may have spent decades resenting the walls he didn't know he had. Without them, there might not have been a story worth telling about him at all. There's a closing paradox worth naming here, one this documentary will let stand without trying to resolve it neatly. The same boundary that stripped Rick of the absolute freedom he assumed he had is also, quietly, the thing that makes his story legible to an audience at all. A being with truly unlimited options, unlimited universes, unlimited versions of every possible outcome would be nearly impossible to write compelling drama around, because nothing that character does could ever carry irreversible weight. The curve gives this fiction its gravity. It's the unglamorous, largely unacknowledged reason any of the choices we've traced across this documentary, Rick Prime's cruelty, Rick C-137's obsession, Evil Morty's patience, actually mean something within the story, rather than dissolving into just one outcome among functionally infinite others. Which brings us, finally, to where this story currently stands, and where it might still be going. There's one more implication of the Central Finite Curve worth drawing out before we close this chapter of the history. If the curve genuinely was constructed rather than naturally occurring, then someone, or something, once possessed the ability to reshape the multiverse at a scale beyond anything even Rick Prime has demonstrated. That possibility quietly recontextualizes the entire hierarchy the show has spent seasons establishing. Rick Prime sits at the top of every hierarchy we've been shown so far, the most capable version of the most capable being in this fictional universe. But the curve implies a ceiling above even him, a power exercised so long ago, so completely, that its authors have vanished entirely from the story, leaving only the boundary itself as evidence they ever existed. Power, in this mythology, doesn't just corrupt or isolate. It eventually erases its own history, leaving only its consequences behind for smaller minds to puzzle over generations later. Section 7. The Future of Portal Technology. We don't open this final section with a single dramatic scene the way the others began. Instead, we open with an accumulation, small moments scattered across Season 7, glimpses of a Rick who uses his portal gun with the same practiced ease as always, but who occasionally, almost imperceptibly, pauses a half-second longer before pulling the trigger. It's subtle, easy to miss, but once you've traced this technology's entire history, its theft, its collapse, its hidden boundaries, that pause reads differently than it might have in Season 1. Portal travel, as it exists in the show's current era, remains largely unchanged on the surface. Green portals still open on command, the Citadel still functions, rebuilt from its earlier collapse, Rick still uses the technology the way he always has, casually, constantly, without ceremony. But the audience now carries knowledge the show has slowly, deliberately built across its run. We know this technology was never fully his invention. We know it can fail, catastrophically, at a scale that cripples an entire civilization. We know it operates within a boundary neither Rick nor most of the multiverse's population ever knew existed. And we know that breaching that boundary, however rare, is possible. Which means the illusion of total containment was never absolute either. That layered knowledge changes how even routine portal use reads in the show's most recent episodes. Nothing about the technology itself needs to change for its meaning to shift entirely. The open question hanging over the technology's future is one the show seems increasingly interested in exploring rather than resolving. Does Rick still control this invention, or has he simply gotten skilled enough at pretending he does? Every major arc we've covered points toward the same uncomfortable answer. Rick didn't invent portal travel from nothing. It came from Rick Prime. He doesn't fully control its infrastructure. The Citadel does, collectively, fragile as that collective control turned out to be. He doesn't have unlimited access to reality. The Central Finite Curve ensures that. And he isn't immune to its failure. Solarix proved that beyond argument. What's left, then, isn't mastery in the way the early seasons implied. It's familiarity. Rick knows this technology better than almost anyone else in the multiverse, but knowing something intimately isn't the same as controlling it absolutely. Perhaps that's always been the quiet truth underneath the show's loudest, most chaotic technology. Portal travel was never really about power. It was about how convincingly one broken, brilliant man could disguise his own limitations as limitlessness. There's a version of Rick's arc, taken as a whole, that reads less like a story about a genius scientist and more like a story about a man who built an increasingly elaborate set of excuses not to sit still. Every new portal gun, every recalibration, every desperate repair during the fluid crisis, every boundary he never bothered to question, all of it in service of the same underlying goal: never being forced to stay anywhere, or with anyone, long enough for the consequences of staying to catch up with him. Seen from that angle, the entire technological history this documentary has traced stops looking like an escalating arms race between geniuses and starts looking like something closer to a single, sustained avoidance behavior, repeated across decades, refined across universes, dressed up in increasingly impressive engineering so that neither Rick nor the audience has to look directly at what it's actually accomplishing. Every improvement in calibration, every added layer of personalization, every hard-won repair adds sophistication to the mechanism without ever changing its underlying function. It's still, at the deepest level, the same gesture Rick performed the very first time some version of him decided that leaving felt safer than staying. Everything since has simply been refinement. And yet, in small, quiet moments scattered across the most recent seasons, something in that pattern seems to be shifting, if only slightly. The hesitation before the trigger. The willingness, however brief, to sit inside a consequence rather than immediately portal away from it. None of this undoes decades of established character, but it suggests the show hasn't finished asking its central question. It's still circling it, patiently, the way Rick himself never quite manages to. Where the show goes from here remains genuinely open. Future seasons may deepen the mystery of who or what constructed the Central Finite Curve. They may explore further consequences of the portal fluid crisis, or introduce new versions of the technology entirely, built by Ricks we haven't met yet, each with their own philosophy encoded into the machinery. What seems unlikely to change, based on everything canon has shown us so far, is the core emotional truth sitting beneath the science fiction. Portal travel will keep being used as an escape, and Rick will keep needing to escape, because the thing he's actually running from was never a place, a universe, or a curve. There's a fitting symmetry in ending this history where the show itself seems most interested in lingering. Not on a new gadget, not on a bigger threat, but on the small human question of whether a person capable of leaving anything, at any time, for any reason, can ever choose to stay. Every technological leap we've traced across this documentary, from Rick Prime's original design to the Central Finite Curve's hidden boundary, ultimately funnels back into that single, deceptively simple question. The multiverse is vast. The technology is dazzling. But the story, underneath all of it, has always been about one man deciding over and over again whether running is actually working. Before we close this history for good, it's worth taking one last look backward across everything this documentary has covered. Not to summarize it point by point, but to notice the shape it makes when viewed all at once. We began with an ending, a trigger that produced nothing, a man confronted with the sudden, total absence of the one capability he'd built his entire identity around. From there, we moved backward into origin, discovering that the very thing defining him wasn't his to begin with. that it arrived already carrying someone else's history, someone else's coldness, someone else's answer to the same unbearable question Rick has spent his whole life avoiding. We moved through mechanism, learning that even a technology this vast still has to negotiate with chemistry, calibration, and the stubborn limits of a body that gets sick from crossing too many boundaries too quickly. We cataloged its many forms, watching each version reveal something distinct about the specific kind of person who built or claimed it. We sat inside a crisis, watching a man who has never once had to wait for anything discover what waiting actually costs. We found a wall neither he nor most of his civilization knew existed, a boundary drawn by hands the story has chosen, deliberately, never to name. And now, at the end, we're left exactly where we started, watching a man reach for a trigger, uncertain, for the first time in a long time, of exactly what pulling it will actually solve. That uncertainty is not a flaw in this mythology. It's the entire point of building one this carefully in the first place. A lesser show would have resolved every thread we've traced, named the architect of the curve, fully explained the fluid's chemistry, given Rick a clean, final arc where he learns his lesson and changes for good. This show refuses all three, and in refusing them, it stays honest to something true about real people rather than fictional ones. Nobody's relationship with their own worst habits resolves cleanly. Nobody gets a tidy, final scene where the running simply stops. The most anyone gets, if they're lucky, is what Rick gets across these 7 sections. Brief, uneven moments where the machinery falters just long enough to remember what it was covering up, before the trigger gets pulled again and the green light returns, and the running, quieter now, a little more hesitant than before, continues. It was always himself. There's a final image worth leaving the audience with, one the show hasn't shown us yet, but which the entire history we've traced points toward. Somewhere, in some universe within or beyond the curve, there may be a version of Rick who finally stops. Not because he's out of universes to run to, but because he's decided, for the first time, that running has stopped being worth the cost. Canon hasn't given us that version yet. Maybe it never will. But the possibility sits quietly underneath every trigger pull we've examined across this entire history. A question the technology itself will never answer, because it was never built to. Only the man holding it can do that. The portal gun was never just another invention. It became the key that unlocked infinite possibilities and infinite consequences. Because the moment one man learned how to step between universes, the multiverse was never truly separate again. Every choice, every timeline, every adventure began with the pull of a single trigger. Before we close entirely, it's worth stepping back from the mythology for a moment and looking at the larger shape of what this documentary has actually traced. We began in a garage with a single, silent click. We ended, 7 sections later, on a question the show itself has never fully answered. In between, we moved through theft, rivalry, mechanics, variation, crisis, boundary, and finally, uncertainty. That arc mirrors, deliberately, the emotional arc of the character at its center. Rick Sanchez doesn't experience his own story as a clean, linear progression either. He experiences it the way this documentary has been structured, in fragments, in flashes of clarity followed by long stretches of avoidance, in moments of forced stillness interrupted almost immediately by the next available exit. That structural choice matters for anyone revisiting this documentary a second time, perhaps as background while falling asleep, perhaps while rewatching the show itself with fresh eyes. The portal gun was never simply a plot device that let the writers generate new settings each week. It was, from its very first appearance, a character study disguised as a piece of technology. Every specification we've covered, the fluid, the targeting system, the ambient power source, the boundary it cannot cross, exists in service of a much older, much more human question. What does a person become when escape is always available? And what happens to that person in the rare moments when it isn't? Consider, too, how unusual it is for a science fiction comedy to sustain this kind of thematic coherence across so many seasons without ever collapsing into simple technobabble. Most long-running genre shows eventually let their central technology become pure spectacle, bigger, louder, more visually impressive, but hollowed out of meaning. Rick and Morty resists that drift, largely because it keeps tethering every new revelation about portal travel back to character. The Central Finite Curve isn't interesting because it's a clever piece of world building. It's interesting because it recontextualizes a man's entire understanding of his own freedom. The portal fluid crisis isn't interesting because it's a resource management subplot. It's interesting because it forces a chronically impatient character to sit inside his own limitations for the first time in years. There's also something worth saying about why this particular mythology resonates with audiences well beyond its animated, absurdist packaging. Almost everyone, at some point, has built their own version of a portal gun, a coping mechanism, a habit, a distraction, a relationship, a job, anything that reliably lets them avoid sitting with an uncomfortable feeling for too long. Few of us have access to interdimensional travel, obviously, but the emotional logic underneath Rick's relationship to his own invention, the reflex to leave rather than stay, the discomfort of being forced to remain somewhere with no immediate exit, is recognizable to nearly anyone who has ever reached for a phone, a drink, a task, anything, specifically to avoid feeling something difficult a moment longer than necessary. That's ultimately why a documentary about a fictional weapon can carry this much emotional weight. It was never really about the weapon. It was about watching, across dozens of episodes in several seasons, what happens to a person who spent his entire existence treating every discomfort as something to be immediately escaped, in the exceedingly rare, exceedingly quiet moments when that pattern briefly, almost imperceptibly, begins to loosen. There's a final observation worth adding here about why this particular character study needed science fiction at all, rather than a more grounded setting. A purely realistic drama about a man who avoids his problems could certainly explore similar emotional territory, but it would lack the one device this show has used so effectively across its entire run: a literal, visible mechanism for avoidance that the audience can watch fail, get repaired, reveal hidden boundaries, and eventually get questioned by its own user. Portal travel externalizes an internal pattern in a way ordinary drama rarely manages. We don't have to infer that Rick avoids his problems. We watch him press a trigger and vanish, over and over, until the show finally asks what that gesture has cost him. And by then, the audience has had years of visual, structural evidence to draw on, rather than a handful of expository conversations. There's a final thought worth adding to close out this observation. Genre fiction gets dismissed sometimes as escapism in its own right. Spectacle for spectacle's sake, disconnected from anything resembling genuine emotional insight. This particular mythology argues against that dismissal about as effectively as any modern animated series has managed. It took the single most escapist premise imaginable, a weapon that lets its owner leave literally anywhere at any time for any reason, and used it to build one of the more patient, careful studies of avoidance in recent television. The spectacle was never separate from the insight. Here, they were always the same thing, built from the same trigger, the same green light, the same 7-part history this documentary has spent its runtime tracing all the way back to a single, silent click in a garage. That's the quiet achievement underneath all the absurdist comedy and interdimensional spectacle this franchise is known for. It found a way to make escapism itself the subject of a story about escapism, using a weapon capable of reaching infinite universes to ask a question that has nothing to do with universes at all, and everything to do with whether any of us, given the chance to leave anything at any moment, would ever actually choose to stay. There's one last thought worth leaving here before this history closes for good. Somewhere in the writing of this show, someone made the quiet decision that a weapon this powerful deserved a psychology, not just a specification sheet. That decision, more than any single episode or twist this documentary has covered, is why a cartoon about a drunk scientist and his grandson has managed to say something true about running from difficulty that plenty of far more serious, far more prestigious dramas never quite managed to land. The technology was always the least interesting part of the story. What it revealed about the man who couldn't stop reaching for it, that was the part worth building an entire mythology around. Whatever version of Rick eventually appears in whatever season comes next, this documentary has tried to leave you with the same open question the show itself keeps returning to. Not whether the portal gun will keep working, it almost certainly will, but whether the man holding it will ever stop needing it to. Fade into silence.